On a cold December morning in 1998, one of gaming's most revered developers appeared before a captive audience in Yokohama, Japan, to present his next-generation vision. The creator, Yu Suzuki, and the game, Shenmue. Combining state-of-the-art technology and new gameplay concepts, this new work would go on to influence the gaming landscape for years to come. This is John from Digital Foundry, and in this installment of DF Retro, we're revisiting the Dreamcast classic with a look back at the game's technical accomplishments and how to best play it in 2016. Let's get started. Shenmue began development in the mid-90s under the guiding hand of Yu Suzuki, a gaming legend whose AM2 team revolutionized arcade gameplay and graphics time and time again. Known only as Project Berkeley at the time, Shenmue was the first AM2 game to be developed specifically for the home console market. This of course meant the Sega Saturn, but that's not where it would stay, nor where it would be revealed. The knowledge gained in its years of creating high-end arcade titles would serve as the foundation for Shenmue, but the original idea was born while researching Virtua Fighter in China. On paper, the idea is straightforward. Combine arcade-quality fighting mechanics and graphics with a full-on role-playing experience. Yet Project Berkeley would transcend two consoles while being split into multiple parts before it would see the light of day. Throughout its development, AM2 did not cease creating high-end arcade experiences. In 1996, the team would release Virtua Fighter 3 running on Sega's Model 3 arcade board. In terms of character rendering, Virtua Fighter 3 stood as a crowning technical achievement, delivering unbelievably detailed character models and arenas, all at 60 frames per second. There was nothing on the market even close to matching this game at the time, yet this would ultimately serve as a visual target for AM2 with Shenmue. The original project did indeed start on the Sega Saturn. The results were incredible for the hardware, with highly detailed character models and environments that far exceed just about anything else we had seen on the platform. AM2 was a master of the Saturn hardware, but Shenmue was perhaps too ambitious. As the game was in development, Sega's next-generation console started to take form. AM2 seized the opportunity, and the console that would become known as Sega Dreamcast would become the first home platform on the market capable of delivering on its original vision. This was the game that Yu Suzuki would finally show to the public on December 20th, 1998. To fully appreciate just what was happening, we need to consider that, at the time of Shenmue's reveal, the Dreamcast had just launched in Japan. When it came to displaying high-quality character models rendered in real time, Virtua Fighter 3 remained top dog. Even a PC equipped with the latest 3DFX Voodoo card wasn't capable of delivering anything close to a Model 3 game. Then we have Shenmue, a game that seemed to combine the visual fidelity of an arcade title with an open-ended adventure game. When you combine the legacy of AM2 with such aspirations, it was hard not to become excited. There was no other game in the works with so much talent, money, and creative freedom behind it. How could it fail? As development pushed on and more details were revealed, it soon became clear that Shenmue was a project too large for its own good. The beautiful scenes demonstrated in China and plastered across Dreamcast magazines everywhere would not even be present in the first release of Shenmue. Instead, the game was narrowed in scope and presented as Chapter 1 in a multi-part saga. Thus, Shenmue Yokosuka was born. 1 year after its unveiling, Shenmue hit the Japanese market, and Sega fans around the world awaited impressions with bated breath. These impressions were somewhat mixed, however, but through it all, it was clear that Shenmue was something truly unique and special. It may not have completely lived up to expectations, but the end product was still an incredibly interesting piece of software that many could not wait to play. At the time of its release, the idea of an open-world game was still relatively new. Sure, Bethesda Softworks had been releasing Elder Scrolls games over the years, and new titles such as Quantic Dream's Omikron presented a massive metropolis for players to explore, but none of these games focused on the minutiae quite like Shenmue. By today's standards, Yokosuka is a rather small environment, but there was an unparalleled level of detail to be found within. Shenmue offered a large number of individual items which the players could freely manipulate. You wander the streets reading nameplates on houses, making purchases at vending machines, and browsing the shelves at a local convenience store. objects which had no impact on the actual gameplay were fully textured and made available for players in the name of immersion. This attention to detail was pretty remarkable at the time, and it's also likely one of the reasons for the massive budget. Character models were similarly impressive. When looking at the competition, it was clearly a huge step up in terms of detail. There was a sense that AM2 had truly succeeded in delivering arcade fighting game quality character models in an open-ended adventure. Of course, secondary character models didn't always fare so well in comparison, which unfortunately was a necessary compromise of the day. Cutscenes were also presented entirely in real time. This sort of presentation was becoming popular at the time, thanks in part to Metal Gear Solid, but Shenmue took this to the next level. Animation work and character detail in these scenes was truly a generation beyond other comparable games. These characters moved naturally with finer details fully represented and animated. Eyes could look around the scene, mouth movement was synchronized to speech, clothing flowed naturally, and characters even had 5 articulate fingers. Of course, one of the game's strengths could also be considered a weakness by some. There is an ambition here that you do not often see today. Yu Suzuki truly wanted to create a virtual world for players to explore. This sometimes meant paying attention to schedules and dealing with a real-time clock. Events were defined by values on this clock in which 24 hours were compressed to 1 hour of gameplay. If you needed to visit a local bar for information, you would have to wait until they opened in the evening. Again, it was an attempt to create a more realistic world for the player, sometimes at the expense of convenience. Shenmue focused on both the exciting and mundane aspects of existing in a virtual space. This, of course, ties into the weather system as well. Shenmue used what was labeled the Magic Weather System, which was tied to real-world weather data taken from this period in time. By tying dynamic weather to a time-of-day system, Shenmue was able to present a more dynamic environment to explore. The game also required players to tackle navigation in a more natural way, reading signs, talking to people, and learning the town layout. This is the 80s after all, so you aren't going to be pulling out a mobile phone for directions. You actually need to look and listen here. We've become so accustomed to mini-maps and waypoints these days, but Shenmue actually asks players to observe and learn instead. In many ways, Shenmue also looks rather unlike other Dreamcast games at the time. The arcade roots are evident in its texturing, lighting, and shadows. Shenmue did not make use of mip-maps, for instance, which resulted in texture shimmering, yet also helps give the impression of greater detail at a distance. Most Dreamcast games used bilinear filtering with obvious steps between various mip-map layers, yet Shenmue shared more with Model 3 arcade games by not making use of them at all. Also, certain textures such as the skybox use point sampling, resulting in obvious pixelation if you look closely. The game also presented its own take on effects such as motion blur. It's crude compared to what we have today, but it was an uncommon thing on the platform and it helped accentuate important visual moments. Beyond this, Shenmue makes use of shadows which properly reflect the size and shape of the objects casting them. Ryo's primary shadow is rendered using modifier volumes, which is very common on the system, but other shadows within the scene are handled differently. This became clear after playing with Dreamcast emulators where it is possible to disable modifier volumes completely and see that only Ryo's shadow would disappear. All of this was achieved at a relatively steady frame rate. Shenmue operates at 30 frames per second, the majority of the time. Busy scenes do sometimes suffer from drops in performance, but considering the game's ambition, the level of performance on display here remains very impressive nonetheless. For the Dreamcast, this was quite an achievement. Other attempts at large-scale environments on the platform were often met with very inconsistent frame rates, but Shenmue managed to do it all at a very steady clip. Overall, the presentation is very impressive here, but there are some technical issues that limit the game's potential. First and foremost, there are the countless loading screens. Due to the limited memory of the Dreamcast and the speed of optical drives during this era, it was not possible to present the world as a continuously streaming environment. Instead, the game world is broken up into a handful of areas with separately loaded interiors. Loading times are not especially quick, and moving back and forth between areas can become somewhat tedious as a result. Then there are issues with audio. The compression of voiceovers and sound effects has a pretty significant impact on quality. Everything is stored at a low bitrate and the results can be rather harsh at times.
この辺りで中国人に詳しい人を探してるんです。誰か知りませんか？
薬局のそばの中華料理屋さんに行かれてみては？
味市ですか？
はい。
The soundtrack is interesting here as well. Some tracks are pre-recorded and suffer from similar compression issues. But the majority of the soundtrack uses samples processed by the Dreamcast's Yamaha audio chip. The sample-based music tracks manage to sound very crisp in comparison to the rest of the game's audio. Ultimately, despite its age and some of these limitations, Shenmue remains an impressive piece of software even today. It's interesting to look back on what was achieved at the time, even if certain decisions can drag down the pacing of the experience. For anyone hoping to revisit the game in this day and age then, you might be wondering just what is the best way to play it in 2016? Well, there are two methods which we recommend here. First and foremost, you can enjoy Shenmue on the original Dreamcast hardware. The console itself is low priced at this point and relatively easy to obtain. When combined with a VGA box, it's possible to output a sharp 640x480 progressive image. Many TVs offer VGA input with minimal processing, but it's also possible to convert the VGA pinout to something usable on a video scaler such as the XRGB series. For this video, we were able to directly connect the Dreamcast to our capture card thanks to support for analog DVI input. More than any other console in this era, the Dreamcast is still capable of producing a very crisp and clean image that is compatible with a wide range of displays. Playing on the Dreamcast will give you the most accurate Shenmue experience. But this is the HD era and many users demand sharper visuals. This is where PC emulation comes into play. Dreamcast emulation is pretty impressive at this point, with a great number of games operating very smoothly at much higher resolutions. In the case of Shenmue, we found that NullDC works best. You can greatly improve image quality while still maintaining smooth performance even on a mid-range PC. By default, games will be drawn in the standard 4:3 aspect ratio, but it is actually possible to draw extra geometry outside of this range, delivering a true 16:9 presentation in the process. Unfortunately with Shenmue, the method used for drawing polygons doesn't always play nicely with this feature, and you can often wind up with visible artifacts along the left and right side of the screen. As such, we actually prefer the 4:3 option here. Emulation is quite good for the most part, but it's not 100% perfect just yet. With DSP emulation enabled, the audio never sounds quite right, and certain versions of NullDC can introduce audio errors in specific situations. We had the best luck with a custom Shenmue build of the emulator that is floating around. Some aspects of rendering aren't quite right either. We noticed issues with hair rendering at points, and occasional shadow bugs, for instance. Some problems were correctable by adjusting settings, but others, such as the hair issue, remain regardless. Still, the benefit of a higher resolution and the ability to play on the PC helps make up for it, and emulated Shenmue is a great way to experience the game today. Actually replaying the game can test the patience of modern gamers, but it's still something truly worth investing time in. This is a game that pushed against the odds to deliver something truly revolutionary. But this was not the end of the Shenmue saga. We shall return to the world of Shenmue in the future and examine its sequel, Shenmue 2. What enhancements does it bring to the original game, and how does the Xbox port stack up? Be sure to tune in and find out. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. And of course, thanks for watching. And until next time, this is John signing off.